Do you ever feel lonely in a room full of friendly faces, when a quick glance is enough to make you acutely aware of the distance between you and a fairly familiar crowd? Do you ever feel entirely content in your own company? Moments where you're so present, the entire world feels palpable at your fingertips. But what about those times that you're rushing through your days, either fueled by some sort of exhausting adrenaline or in a daze so empty it could swallow you whole? I can relate to all of the above. More often than not, these states have little to do with my external environment and are almost entirely influenced by my own inner condition. It seems that, in a sense, to an extent, my world reflects my mind. Considering that my inner form tends to hold up a mirror to the rest of my world, I find that looking inwards is a helpful starting point in improving my relationship with my surroundings. The ideal setting for this usually requires some form of solitude. When I talk about solitude, I don't want you to imagine an empty cell. Especially after the pandemic pushed so many of us into isolation, it's clear that there is a fragile boundary between life-enhancing and harmful solitude. The former is usually chosen, temporary, and framed by social interaction, while the latter is uncertain and imposed. When I talk about solitude, I want you to imagine some sort of inner stillness. Your thinking mind becomes quiet. The constant and somewhat exaggerated commentary on the details of your everyday ceases. You are fully attentive and mostly content. I realise that there are probably skeptics among us, those that would wave away the concept of inner stillness as something plucked from a pocket dictionary at a beginner's wellness retreat. But actually, you've probably all experienced it. Gently staring at a sunset that wipes your thoughts away, intensely gardening, cooking, driving, anything that allows you to do and not think. When we take time for ourselves, the energies that we have distributed in different people, relationships, pursuits, projects can regather themselves, like a bird finding its home to nest. A few years ago, I was terrified of being alone. It went against everything that I loved about my life. I loved connecting with people, laughing until my stomach hurt for hours after, sharing moments that I would carry with me beyond those moments in time, a fleeting but fulfilling exchange with a complete stranger. If I could have had it my way, I wouldn't have chosen solitude in any given moment. I was sad for those who I saw alone. I assumed that they were lonely. And to avoid this feeling myself, I distracted myself by depending on people and things around me. I grabbed onto them to avoid sinking. But what I didn't realize back then was that emptiness and vastness are just two sides of the same story. After all, loneliness is just solitude with a problem. The key difference then between solitude as rejuvenation and solitude as loneliness is the quality of self-reflection that we choose when we're in it, and the ability to return to our social setting whenever we choose to. During the pandemic, this choice was taken from us. We were robbed of human connection, and it was the equivalent of starving. Scientists at MIT discovered that being alone for 10 hours caused activity in the brain similar to being deprived of food for 10 hours. And while prolonged isolation may be novel for the majority of us, it's not actually uncommon for us to find ourselves retreating as a form of emotional shielding in times of crisis. Sometimes we may involuntarily withdraw out of fear or hopelessness or dejection, but it's still powerful to remember that in those cases we can reclaim our agency and choose productive self-reflection in solitude. We may be social creatures, but there are ways of being alone that in turn nurture our relationships with other people, enriching our connections and allowing them to flourish. Despite its appearance, the journey inwards and solitude can be extremely rewarding. A little while ago, I found a path to my own inner stillness through solo travel. Most of the time, we can recognize when we are burnt out, we feel overwhelmed, disconnected. And while we can recuperate through everyday activities of self-care, sometimes we choose to satiate a deeper calling. So we travel. In travel, there is an implicit promise that if we take ourselves away into the unknown, there may be a different version of ourselves waiting on the other side. For me, whether rather dramatically staring out a window on a long train ride or lost along a pink sand beach, solitude in solo travel is my chosen restorative practice. But beneath the charm of solo travel, there are whispers of a stigma, particularly for women. More widely, there is a lurking suspicion that follows women into any of their expressions of independence. For us, though, solo travel is the ultimate practice of autonomy. Through solo travel, women can experience solitude as self-strengthening. We realize that we are content without relying on anyone and anything around us. In this discovery, we affirm our resilience to push through moments of hardship. And in this state, we understand ourselves away from the intimate comforts that shape, mold, and impact us. We can find our own voice again. We learn to love ourselves again. Pretty extravagant claims, right? That solo travel is this entirely transformative, completely revitalizing experience. Well, this promise is exactly what started me on my journey in creating Amica. At a time when I wanted to travel solo, but I didn't have the confidence to take the leap alone, I searched for solutions that could have made it easier for me to experience the benefits of solo travel, but with a safety net. In attempting to plan my trip, I realized that the barriers of entry for women into solo travel were unreasonably high. Concerns of safety formed a persistent cloud over the hopeful promises of solo travel. For me, my peers, or women whose freedoms are far more curtailed than our own, we are all inhibited in one way or another by deep-rooted, biased systems, behaviors, and structures. Solo travel then becomes a reserved privilege rather than a rite of safe passage. And during the pandemic, while travel stalled for almost everyone, this possibility never existed for many women in the first place. We're primarily urged to consider safety when traveling solo, and while this can't be ignored, I wanted to enhance the flavor of the underlying allure to solo travel: freedom, connection, and self-discovery. In a bold attempt to level the playing field and ensure that every woman had the access to solo travel, I created Amica. Amica is a global community for women traveling solo. The Amica app seeks to empower women to experience the independence of solo travel and feel secure on their journeys around the world in a way that doesn't compromise on our autonomy, through making new and meaningful connections with women around the globe. This is exactly the solution that I was searching for when I wanted to travel solo. I strongly believe that every woman, every person, deserves to fearlessly explore the world and their interests. In order to do this, the power needs to be returned to women's hands, in a specially carved out place for them to travel and connect on their own terms, to live out their best lives in a way that the world doesn't make it too easy for them to do so. Amica started as a rough idea in the summer of 2019. I never really stopped to question whether I should pursue it. I just felt this urgency that I needed to. When testing the waters with friends and complete strangers, special thanks to the girls in club bathrooms who formed my impromptu focus groups, I realized how common and relatable my own fears and temptations around solo travel really were. Being totally new to the startup world, I was mostly self-taught, from spending hours online researching the possible routes of bringing an idea to life through tech, to specific details about app development, marketing, building a team, and the nuances of fundraising. Following my initial download of info, a cold and overly enthusiastic email to a venture builder, a sort of pitch, tech incubator for ideas, led to a very early pitch. And They were sold on the vision and the potential and my unwavering belief that this was absolutely necessary for every woman in the world. And it was the first stroke of luck that set everything in motion. So I introduced Amica to the world and set up all of our digital channels a week before the first lockdown in March 2020. Realizing that strict global travel bans were going to be a slight obstacle to our planned app launch, I thought carefully about the value that we could provide. There was still a gap for Amica in the market, even before our product had launched, and so we filled this space and occupied it by generating conversation, sparking inspiration, and organically growing our community around shared experience. Fast forward a year, we found ourselves surrounded by a global community of travel lovers, and finally launched our app in the summer of 2021. From the moment I started, I've been operating entirely out of my comfort zone. It's been grueling, it's demanded a lot, and the beginning stages especially, I was learning everything from scratch at pace to a high standard. It required grit and almost a delusional level of self-belief that had to keep me going through the many painful times I was overlooked and rejected. But I learned that it's okay to step back, pause, and say no too. I gave up many times, I cried more consistently than I physically knew was possible. Above all, I felt lonely. Particularly as a solo founder, my experience felt miserably unique, that there was nowhere to turn but inside, where everything festered. But through steep learnings and unexpected redirections, I learnt that my tears were watering something to grow. I suppose if we commit ourselves to a journey with a sprinkle of grace and a lot of self-effort, we'll find something worthwhile. So after a grueling 2 years of what unsurprisingly did become a business, alongside still working full-time, amplified by consuming few months of fundraising to no avail, I was completely burnt out. I fell out of love with Amica. I was constantly anxious, catastrophizing, overly sensitive to my environment, lacking in self-worth from the constant kicks of rejection. I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that Amica could cease to exist solely because we were falling at the fundraising hurdle. I poured everything into this, I wore myself out, and I resented it. And solo travel, this ultimate affirmation to oneself, was not possible all this time I was building a solo travel app. The cruel irony is not lost on me. But I realized that perhaps when I needed it the most, the world started to open up again, and so I took the leap and booked a flight to my first proper solo trip. My chosen solitude in this case was necessary to prepare me to participate in social life again. Before I was ready to keep company with others, I needed to remind myself how to healthily be alone again. Time with myself plunged me entirely into my own company, which I'm usually distracted from when I'm in my known routine. It was uncomfortable at first, and everything rose to the surface. Surprisingly, my unease didn't just fade away with the crystal clear waters that I found myself wading in. But they didn't need to. As I stood with my toes dug firmly into the warm pink sand, I breathed deeply for what felt like the first time in months. This simple act of slowing down allowed me to slow my thoughts and gave me the space for perspective. It wasn't easy at first, but as the days passed on my sunny Greek island, I eventually found solace in my own company. I took myself out for dinner, a small triumph, eating out alone for the first time, and I didn't feel a speck of sadness, only contentment. On my last day, I walked to the top of a hill overlooking the sunrise, and I watched my first ever sunrise alone. I took my notebook with me, which is usually a trusted outlet for all of my ramblings, but as I opened it up, I didn't have any words. My mind was so quiet, so still, that all that filled the space was gratitude for that moment. Being totally by myself meant that I could reflect, explore my own mind, and understand myself internally. I critically faced my fears, I was patient with myself, and after some loving self-talk, I realised that the one person who had been there with me throughout everything was myself. With intentional self-reflection, I found that inner voice again, the one that was my best friend, my greatest cheerleader. And by reconnecting with aspects of myself that I had previously neglected, I found the courage to enter my life again in a role beyond a mere bystander. Some people say that we come with our own built-in vastness, and if we just settle ourselves enough, we might find that everything we're seeking is already here. In my solitude, I was able to shake the dust and recover what I had lost sight of, my own hidden treasure. By removing myself from the orbit of my own world, I saw who I really was without it. I came back to myself. I came home. You don't have to travel far to find solitude. Solitude doesn't really even have form or definition. Simply find a moment alone and the waves will surely roll back to the shore. Thank you.